She didn't ask for a meal. She stood at the edge of a stranger's yard in October sleet, a child tied to her back, and she asked for the bucket. Not the pot on the stove, not the bread cooling on the sill. The bucket, the one the dogs eat from. That's what she thought she was worth that night. That's what 11 days of running had taught her. The man in the doorway had a rifle in his hands and 40 acres of nothing behind him. And he'd been setting 2 plates at his table for 3 years for a brother who was never coming back to sit down. He didn't make a speech. He didn't preach at her. He just went back inside and started cooking, and he didn't stop. Venison, beans, cornbread that came out lopsided, peaches he'd been saving for a day that never had a name. By midnight, there was more food on that table than either of them could eat in a week, and she still wouldn't sit down. This is the story of the longest night on the Mogollon Rim, and of a table built for 6 people who never came, and of a woman who had to decide whether being fed was worth being seen. Stay with me, because what came up that road before dawn, that's the part I still can't put down. That's what I wrote in the ledger that night, and it's a lie the way most true things are lies. 19 head, 1 lame, 1 woman at the fence, like she was livestock, like she was weather. I didn't know how else to write it. I'd been keeping that ledger 11 years, and it had never once asked me to describe a human face. She was standing at the wire when I came around the corner of the barn with an armload of split pine, and I'll tell you the truth. I dropped the wood, every stick. It went across my boots, and one piece caught my shin, and I said something my mother would have slapped me for. And by the time I got my rifle up off the peg inside the barn door, she hadn't moved an inch. That's the first thing I knew about her. Most folks flinch when a man reaches for a gun. She just stood there in the sleet with her hands on the top wire, and she watched me the way you watch weather coming across a valley, like it was going to do what it was going to do, and moving wasn't going to change it. The wind was coming off the rim that night the way it does in October, with that sound in it, that long ripping sound like somebody dragging a saw across a fence post about a half-mile off. Sleet, not snow. Sleet is the mean one. Snow will bury you, but sleet will find you. It gets in the seams. She had a coat on that had been a soldier's coat once. Blue wool, gone the color of dishwater, cut off at the bottom with something dull so the hem was chewed. It was 4 sizes too big, and it didn't fit her anywhere. Under it she was nothing but angles. And on her back, in a cradle board that had been broken and rebuilt with harness leather and hay wire, there was a child. I want to be honest about the order of things, because I've told this story wrong before in the version where I'm a better man than I am. In the true version, my first thought was not that woman is starving. My first thought was, Apache. And my second thought was, how many more of them are in that tree line? That's what I thought. That's what I was raised into. It sat in me like a rock in a boot, and I'd never once taken the boot off to look. I stood there in my own yard with a rifle across my chest and my heart going like a horse in a chute. And I said, loud, stupid, over the wind, "You alone?" She didn't answer. I said, "Are you alone?" Her mouth moved. Nothing came out of it. Sleet had crusted white along one eyebrow, and she blinked it out, and I watched her gather herself, physically gather herself, the way a man does before he lifts something heavy. And then she said, and I'll hear it until they put me down, "The bucket." I said, "What?" "The bucket." She lifted one hand off the wire and made a small motion at the ground, 2 inches of motion. It was all she had. "For the dogs, what you throw." And she looked away from me, and I understood in a rush that went through me like cold water down my collar that she had rehearsed that. She had walked some distance in this weather, rehearsing the smallest possible thing she could ask a white man for. She had done the arithmetic on it. A plate is a favor. A meal is a debt. But scraps you throw away anyhow. She'd worked it out so I wouldn't have to give her anything at all. My name is Amos Teague, and I have never in my life known what to say. My brother Ott had the words. Ott could talk a horse out of a river. He'd walk into a place and inside of 10 minutes he'd know the name of every man in it and something private about half of them, and he'd tell it back to me later, on the ride home, laughing so hard he had to hold the horn. I was the one who nodded. I've been the one who nodded my whole life. Ott went off a bluff on a green colt in February of '84. He was 31. The colt lived. I built the table before that. That's the part that matters here. I built a table out of milled pine milled, hauled it up 40 miles. That's what kind of fool I was, because Ott was going to marry the Hessler girl and there'd be children. And I had it in my head there'd be a Sunday where 6 people sat down in this house at once and there'd be noise in it. Elbows. Somebody spilling something. 6 chairs, I built 6. I have sat at the end of that table for 3 years, and I have set out 2 plates every single night, mine and his, and I have scraped the second one clean into the dog bucket every single night. And if you think that's madness, I'd agree with you, and I'd do it again tomorrow. So when that woman said bucket, understand, she was asking me for the only thing in that house I had never once given away without it costing me something. I said, come inside. She took a step back. I said it worse the second time, louder, like she was deaf instead of terrified. Come inside, it's... She took another step back and her hand went behind her, up toward the child, and I saw her weight shift onto her back foot, and I understood she was about to run. Out into that, in the dark, in sleet, with a baby, and she'd do it. She'd absolutely do it. Because whatever was inside my house was worse in her arithmetic than dying in the open. I put the rifle down in the mud. I don't know why. It wasn't strategy. My hands did it before I got permission from the rest of me. I set it down in the wet like it was a thing I'd found and didn't want, and I stepped back from it, and I held both my hands out where she could see them, and I said, there's a fire, that's all. There's a fire and I'll go stand out here if you want the house. Sleet hissing on the stovepipe behind me, that's the sound I remember. That thin TSS. She looked at the rifle in the mud a long time, longer than was comfortable, rain running off the end of her nose. Then she said, quiet, and this is the whole of it, this is everything. He is cold. Not I'm cold. 11 days. I found that out later. 11 days on that mountain in October, and the first thing she'd said about her own body was nothing at all. Oct 14 Cont. Fire built up. Coffee scorched, usual. Stew from Thursday doubled it. She wouldn't come past the door frame. I want you to see this room. It's 20 feet by 16. There's a stove I call the judge because it's black and it's heavy and it has opinions. There's a rope bed and a high chair and one shelf of books I've read so many times they've stopped meaning anything. And there's that table, that ridiculous long pine table with 6 chairs pushed in under it, taking up half of everything, so that a man has to sidle around his own life to get from the stove to the door. She stood in the doorway with the sleet coming in behind her, and the child on her back had woken up and was making that thin sound bobbies make when they're too tired to properly cry, and she stood there, and she would not come in. I said, you're letting the heat out. She said, I will take it outside. Take what outside? What you give me. And she looked at the dog bucket by the stove. I keep it there, the tin one. And she looked at it the way I've seen men look at a woman they're not allowed to look at. And then she looked at the floor. Now, I have thought about the next part more than I've thought about anything else in my life, including my brother. And I still don't know if what I did was kindness, or if it was the meanest thing a man ever did to a starving woman. Because what I did was, I picked up that dog bucket and I walked past her, and I stepped out into the yard, and I turned it over in the mud. Slop grease, 3-day beans, gone. Then I came back in with the empty bucket and set it upside down by the stove, and I said, well, now there's no scraps. She stared at me, rain in her eyelashes. Her jaw worked and I watched something come up behind her eyes, and I honest to God thought she was going to hit me. I hope she wanted to. She had the right. I said, there's stew. There's bread from this morning. It's not much and it's not for free. You can chop kindling in the morning if that squares it. I don't care, I'll take it in kindling. But there is nothing left in this house to throw out, and I'm not going to make some for you. That's what I meant to say. Whether it came out that clean I doubt. The child made that sound again. She came in. 4 steps. That's as far as she got, 4 steps, and then she stopped right where the floorboards start, and she stood there dripping like something pulled out of a well. She would not sit down. I set a bowl on the table. She looked at it. I moved it to the end of the table nearest her. She looked at it. I gave up and set it on the flat of the stove where the warm is, and I went and stood on the far side of the room by the books with my back turned, and I heard her move. I heard the cradle board come off. I heard her breathing change when the weight left her shoulders, a sound I've made myself, lifting a saddle off after 11 hours, that little grunt, and it went straight through my chest to hear it out of her. I heard cloth. I heard her get down on the floor by the stove, not on a chair, on the floor, and I turned around because I couldn't help it. She had the boy out on her lap, maybe 2 years old, maybe less. He was small the way a thing is small when it hasn't been fed, which is a different small. Black hair stuck flat to his skull with rain. He had a stone in his fist, just a rock, a river rock, and he wouldn't let go of it. And later I learned that rock was the only thing in the world that belonged to him. And she was feeding him. With her fingers, out of the bowl, blowing on it first, testing it against her own wrist, and every time he got a mouthful she'd wait, watching him swallow, watching his throat, and when he swallowed she'd close her eyes for about half a second. She fed him the entire bowl. She did not put one bite in her own mouth. I stood there by my shelf of read-out books with my hands hanging, and I could not tell you what I felt because there is no word for it in the language I've got. It was not pity. Pity's warm and comfortable, and I've felt it plenty. This was something with an edge on it. She scraped the bowl with 2 fingers, got the last of it into him. Then she set the bowl down on the floor beside her, exactly, carefully, like it was china, and she folded her hands in her lap and she looked at the fire. Her hands were shaking, not from cold. She'd been by that stove 20 minutes. They were shaking the way a man's hands shake at the end of a long pull on a rope when he's let go, and the shake is everything he didn't let out while he was holding on. So I cooked. I want to be clear that there was no plan in it. I'm not a good man with a plan. I went to the stove and I put the skillet on and I cut venison off the hindquarter hanging in the cold room and I laid it in the grease, and while that was going I dug out the sourdough crock. I keep it in an old coat, in a box, by the flue. It's about the only thing in this house I'm tender with, and I started bread. I made cornbread too. I don't know why. It came out lopsided because I never leveled the judge and the whole stove leans about 2 degrees south, and everything I bake comes out like a hill. I made coffee and burned it. I always burn it. I opened a tin of peaches. Those peaches had been on that shelf since '85. Ott bought them in Hallbrook and said we'd open them for something. He never said what. He never got specific about the something. He just put them up there, and every year I dusted the tin and put it back, and by that October I had gotten it into my head that opening those peaches would be a kind of admitting. I hooked the lid up with my knife, and the smell came out, that sweet, syrupy, entirely wrong for a mountain smell, and I set them on the table. And I kept going. Bacon, what was left of a ham. I fried potatoes with too much onion. I found a jar of chokecherry preserve that a woman down in Pleasant Valley gave me for pulling her wagon out of a wash, and I hadn't opened that either, and I opened it. Somewhere in there I stopped being a man making supper and became a man doing something else, filling something. There was a hole in the middle of that room where 6 people were supposed to be sitting, and I was trying to fill it with food, which is the stupidest thing I have ever done, and I couldn't stop. An hour went by. The judge was roaring. The windows ran with steam. The whole cabin smelled like grease and yeast and burnt coffee and sweet syrup, and outside it was sleeting sideways off the rim, and inside it was August. And when I finally turned around, wiping my hands, that table was covered, end to end. Every dish I owned and two I'd forgotten I owned. 6 places worth of food on a table built for 6. The woman had not moved from the floor. She was looking at it. Her mouth was slightly open. The boy was asleep against her with his fist in her hair and that rock still in it. And she said flat, without any expression at all, which is how I knew what it cost her. "Who is coming?" I said, "Nobody's coming." She turned her head and looked at me, and there was so much nothing in her face that I understood, standing there with a dish rag in my hand, that she had not believed one single thing I'd said all night. That she'd come in out of the sleet the way you'd walk into a snare because the alternative was worse. That she'd fed her boy first because she expected to be dragged out of that house before she got a bite herself, and if only one of them was going to eat, it wasn't going to be her. I looked at all that food, and I thought, you idiot, because a table like that doesn't say you're welcome. A table like that says there are others and they're on their way. I did the only thing I could think of. I sat down. Not at the head, not in my chair. I sat on the floor, an old man's knees. It took me a minute, and I made a noise going down that I'm not proud of, and I sat on the floor on the far side of the stove, 6 feet from her with my back against the wood box, and I put my hands on my knees. And I said, "Nobody is coming. Nobody has come here in 3 years." The fire popped. She said after a while, "Why do you make so much?" I opened my mouth to say something sensible. What came out was, "My brother's dead." She waited. He was, and here's a thing about grief. It doesn't come out in the good order. It comes out in whatever order it wants. He could talk to anybody. He'd have talked to you. He'd have known your name in about a minute and he'd have made you laugh. And I've been sitting at that table by myself for 3 years putting out a plate for a man who is in the ground and scraping it into a bucket every night. And I have not told one living soul that until right now. Sleet on the roof. That long tearing wind out on the rim. I said, "So when you ask me for the bucket." And I stopped, because my voice did something I didn't authorize, and I sat there on my own floor with my jaw clamped like a vice, and I looked at the stove door and got a hold of myself. When I could look over at her again, she had turned all the way toward me. Both her hands were on the boy, and she was crying, not making any sound, not even changing her expression, just water coming down her face and dropping off her chin onto that dishwater blue coat, and she wasn't wiping it, and she wasn't looking away from me either. Her name was Bishka. She said it like she was setting something down on a table between us that she might have to pick back up and run with. The boy was not hers. She got the story out over about 2 hours, and it came sideways in pieces, mostly while she was doing something else, sewing the busted seam of the cradle board with sinew and my all, at the table, on the floor by the table, because she still would not sit in a chair. I want that understood. That woman ate her first mouthful of food that night sitting on my floor with her back against the leg of the table she wouldn't sit at. The first mouthful was cornbread. I put a piece down next to her, on a plate, and turned my back and made a lot of noise banging the stove so she could take it without being watched. She took it. I heard her eat it and it made a sound like nothing, like paper, and then I heard her stop, and I heard her breathe out very slowly through her nose, and I knew, the way you know when you've watered a horse too fast, that her body was fighting the food. That's what 11 days does. She had come down off the high country with her sister. Her sister's name was Niles, and I'm going to spell it the way I heard it, and I know I've got it wrong, and I've made my peace with being wrong about it. The boy was Niles. There'd been a scout company out of Fort Apache. There'd been an order, the kind of order that starts as a piece of paper in a room 1,000 miles away and ends as men on horses in the dark. Families were being moved. Some of them had already been moved, a long way on trains, to a place with an ocean in it and a fever in the air. And the ones who'd gone hadn't come back, and the letters home stopped after a while, and everybody knew what that meant even if nobody would say it. They ran. A lot of people ran. That's all renegade ever meant. Most times it meant ran. 11 days. On the 9th day there were riders behind them in the low country and the wind was wrong, and they got up into a bench of rock, and it was going to come down to which way the riders went at the split, and Beshka said, and she said this while pulling sinew through leather, not looking up, her voice absolutely level. She took the red blanket. I said, what? The blanket is red, you can see it very far, pull tie. She took it and she went that way. She tipped her chin at the wall like the wall was a mountain, and I went this way with him. Pull tie. She was faster than me, Beshka said. Always. When we are girls she is always faster, so it should be me who takes the blanket. She bit the sinew off. She did not let me argue. She said, you have him, so you have no choice, so there is nothing to argue. She smoothed the leather down with her thumb. That is a trick, she said, to give someone the child so they cannot be the one who dies. And she looked up at me for 1 second, and there was a rage in that face like a stove door swinging open, and then it shut again, and she went back to her sewing. I have thought a great deal about the difference between somebody who has lost someone and somebody who has been left by someone on purpose. They're not the same wound. One of them heals. Oct 14 Cont. Wind dropped, sleet turned. 2 feet of drift on the north side by midnight. The boy woke around 11 and cried. Not a little. He came up out of sleep howling the way small children do when they've slept in the cold too long and the warm hurts them. And it was a real sound, a big sound, and it filled that cabin. And Bishka's hand went over his mouth. Fast, faster than thought. Flat over his whole face, and she pulled him in against her chest and curled around him and went absolutely still, and her eyes went to the door. I didn't move. I watched a woman kneel on my floor holding her sister's baby with her hand clamped over his mouth in a house 40 miles from the nearest soul, listening for horses, and I watched her count. I could see her doing it, her lips moving a little, and I watched her come back into the room from wherever she had been, and I watched her understand where she was. She took her hand away. She looked at her own hand. The boy was gulping and hiccuping and grabbing at her coat, unhurt, fine, mad about it. And she held that hand out away from herself and looked at it like it belonged to another person. And then she pressed it hard against her mouth and made one sound I will not describe to you. I got up. I got the coffee. I put a cup on the floor by her knee and I did not say a word, and I sat back down against the wood box and I let her have it. Out on the rim the wind had quit. That's the thing about sleet turning to snow. It goes quiet. It gets so quiet you can hear the fire eating. After a long time she said, into the boy's hair. 9 days I did this, every time he cries. I said yes. He is quiet now all the time. She rocked a little, he learned. And she said, in exactly the voice a person uses to say something they have already decided is true and unforgivable. I taught a baby not to cry. I've turned that sentence over about 10,000 times. I turn it over on horseback. I turn it over splitting wood. What I said, God help me, was, you kept him alive. She said yes. That's all, yes. She didn't argue with me and she didn't accept it. She just laid it down next to the other thing, the way you'd lay 2 stones next to each other, and neither one gets any lighter for having a friend. Around midnight I stood up and my knees cracked like green pine, and I went to the table and I looked at all that food going cold, congealing, the peaches sweating in the tin, that absurd lopsided cornbread. I said, this is going to spoil. She didn't answer. I said, it'll spoil and I'll scrape it in a bucket, and there's no dog anymore either because Pilot died in June, so it'll go in the mud. I put my hand flat on the table, on the wood I hauled 40 miles for a wedding that didn't happen. I built this for 6 people. I pulled out a chair. The scrape of it on the boards was the loudest thing in the world. Sit at the table, I said. Not for the food. I don't care about the food. I have been sitting at this table alone for 3 years, and I am asking you as a favor to me, a debt I'll owe you. And that was the wrong thing to say. And I knew it while I was saying it, because I had reached for something clever, and she had spent 11 days having clever things done to her. So I quit. I stood there holding a chair like a fool, and I said the only true sentence I had. Please, I'm so tired of it. Snow ticking on the glass. She stood up. It took her a while. She had the boy on her hip, and she came across those boards one step at a time, and she stopped by the chair, and she put her free hand on the back of it, and she looked at me for what felt like the length of my whole life. Then she sat down. She sat down at my table, and the boy put his rock on the wood next to the peaches, and she picked up a fork and looked at it, and she started to laugh. Quiet, terrible, shaking. One hand over her eyes and the other on the fork, laughing without any joy in it at all, and then with some. And I sat down across from her in Ott's chair, for the first time since February of '84, and I laughed too, and neither one of us could have told you what was funny. We ate. She ate slowly, the way I made her, a little and then wait. He woke enough to gum a piece of bread dipped in peach syrup, and his whole face changed color with the surprise of the sweetness. And Bishka watched him and put her hand over her mouth again, but different this time. All the way different. For about 1 hour on the 14th of October, 1887, in a cabin on the Mogollon Rim with the snow coming down like the sky had let go, there were 3 people at a table built for 6, and there was noise in that house. Somebody spilled something. It was me. I found out later that snow was the reason. If it had stayed sleet, they'd have turned back at the wash. But snow lays a road down, and it lays your tracks up, and it makes a man on a horse feel like God can't see him. She heard it first. She always heard everything first. I think 11 days does that to your ears and never gives it back. She stopped chewing. Her head came up an inch. I said, what? The fire ate, the peaches sweated. And then I heard it too, coming up my road, coming up the long grade past the lame heifer and the fence I never finished, muffled and soft and unmistakable in that new snow. Horses, more than 2. Slow and not hurrying, the way men ride when they're certain and they're cold and they've been in the saddle since noon and they know exactly which door they're coming to. And a voice thinned out by distance, calling something to another voice, then a laugh. Bishka was already on her feet. She had the boy against her chest, and she was looking at the door and then at the window and then at me, and I saw the whole calculation go across her face in half a second. The yard, the tree line, the snow that would take her tracks and hold them up like a lantern for anybody to read, and I saw it come to the end of itself and find nothing there. She looked at my table, all that food, 6 places. And she said, very quietly, in a voice with nothing left in it, they will see. Somebody knocked the snow off his boots on my step. That's where the entry stops, mid-word. I know exactly when I quit writing it because I heard the second horse blow and a man's boot on my step, and I got up so fast the ink went over. There's still a stain on that page, shaped like Arizona. Here is everything I did in the time it takes to say a short prayer, and I want it understood that I did none of it well. I took her by the arm the first time I ever touched her, and I put her through the cold room door, which is not a room, it's a lean-to off the north wall where I hang meat, and it was black in there and 11 degrees, and there was a mule deer hindquarter swinging from a hook. I said, behind it. Sit down behind it and don't stand up. She went. She didn't ask one question. She was already turning the boy's face into her shoulder as she went, already cupping the back of his skull with her whole hand. And the last thing I saw before I pulled that door to was the white of her eye in the dark, and she was not looking at me. She was listening. Then I turned around and looked at my house. The cradle board was on the floor by the stove. A woman's bowl, licked. 2 cups. A wet coat steaming on the back of a chair like a body that had gotten up and walked off. Wet boot prints, small ones, going back and forth in front of the judge. Snow squeaked in the yard. A man said something and another man laughed, and it was the ordinary laugh of a cold man arriving somewhere warm. I put the cradle board in the wood box and shut the lid. And then I picked up that dishwater blue coat, and I opened the stove door and I fed it in. I want you to understand something about wool. It doesn't burn. It sulks. It goes brown and it curls and it puts out a stink like a burnt hoof, like hair, like the worst thing a man ever smelled, and it fills a 20 by 16 room in about 9 seconds and it does not leave for 2 days. I stood there with the stove door open watching a soldier's coat that had kept a woman alive for 11 days go brown at the edges, and I thought, that was hers. That was the only thing she had, and I shut the door on it. Then I sat down at the head of my table, in front of all that cold food, and I picked up a fork. The knock came. 3, and then 2 more, the way a man knocks when he already knows he's coming in. I said, "It's open." There were 4 of them. A sergeant named Bevis, who came in first and took his hat off, which surprised me. A trooper about 19 with a wet mustache he was clearly proud of. Another trooper, older, gray in the beard, who came in and stood by the door with his hands under his armpits and never said a word the entire time except obliged when I gave him coffee. And a civilian. He came in last. He was Apache. He had on a wool coat with a cavalry cape over it and a red rag knotted around his head, and he did not take his hat off because he wasn't wearing one, and he stopped just inside the door and stood there and looked at my table. Not at me, at the table. Sergeant Bevis was saying something about the road and the drifts. I don't remember. I remember the sound my own heart made. I remember that the tracker looked at the 6 chairs, at the 2 chairs pulled out, at the plates, at a stone the size of an egg lying on the pine, next to an open tin of peaches. The sergeant was a heavy man with a good-natured face and about a week of trail on him, and he came around the end of the table and got a look at the spread and stopped talking. "Well," he said. Nobody said anything. "Mr. Teague. Mr. Teague, you expecting the territorial governor?" And I understood, in a way I have never been able to explain to anybody since, exactly what I had to do. It arrived in me whole, like a thing handed down. I had to be crazy. Not act crazy. Be it, out loud, in front of 4 armed men, in the one room where I have never once told the truth about myself. I looked at the food. I put down the fork. I said, "It's for my brother." Bevis said, "Beg pardon." My voice came out wrong and I let it. He's been dead 3 years this February. I set his plate out. I gestured at the second plate, the one Bishka had eaten off of, with her fingerprints in the grease of it. "Every night, scrape it in the bucket after." The young trooper snorted through his mustache, and then thought better of it. I said, "Tonight I got it in my head to," and I stopped, and I looked at that table, and here is where the Lord in his mercy let me tell the exact truth in the exact voice of a lunatic. I got it in my head to cook the whole thing. The peaches. He bought those peaches. 1985 Hallbrook. Said we'd open them for something. The room was quiet. "There isn't any something," I said. "I've been up here a long while." And I looked up at Sergeant Bevis with my eyes doing whatever they were doing, and I watched pity come across that man's face like weather. That's what saved us. Not courage, not cleverness. My grief was the best hiding place in that house, because it was the only thing in it big enough for 2 people to stand behind. Bevis cleared his throat and put his hat on the table, and said the sentence I've held onto for the rest of my life, as evidence that men are not simple. "Well," he said, "it's a hell of a lot of food for one man." He sat down. They all sat down. They ate it. I want to put that down plainly. Four men who had ridden all day looking for a starving woman and a 2-year-old boy sat down at my table and ate the supper I had made for her, and they ate it with pleasure, and they complimented the cornbread, and the young one had 3 helpings of peaches and said his mother made them like that. She was 11 feet away in the dark behind a deer carcass, listening. Bevis unbuttoned his coat and told me their business without my asking, because that's what a warm man does. 2 women and a child out of the reservation, gone 11 days. One of them had been accounted for. That was the phrase he used, accounted for, and he said it while reaching for the ham, and I had to put both my hands flat on my knees under the table and hold on. 9 days ago, low country, a red blanket. Fast, Bevis said, chewing. Christ, she could run. Led 'em 3 miles up a slope a goat wouldn't take. I said, and the other one? Somewhere, he shrugged. He wasn't cruel. That's the thing I can't get past. He was tired and he was doing his job and he wasn't cruel. Snow'll settle it. Nobody walks out of the rim in this. Either we find her or we find her in the spring. The gray-bearded trooper said, obliged about the coffee. And the tracker, who had not sat down, who was standing by the wood box with a plate in his hand, and had not put one bite in his mouth, said, there is a rifle in the yard. Everything in me went to water. Bevis said, what? In the mud, by the fence. The tracker's voice was low and flat, and he had almost no accent at all, which somehow made it worse. It is under the snow now. I stepped on it coming in. 4 faces turned to me. I said, and I heard my own voice from somewhere up near the ceiling, that be mine. You left a gun in the yard, said Bevis. I did. Why in hell would a man do that? And I opened my mouth and nothing came out, because there was no lie in me that fit. Every explanation I could reach for was a door with somebody standing behind it. The tracker set his plate down on the wood box. He said, there is a fence wire down at the north corner, 2 posts. He was fixing it in the sleet and he put the rifle where it would not be in the mud and it fell in the mud. A pause. This is what I saw. I hadn't fixed a wire in 6 weeks. He was looking at me while he said it, not warning me, not conspiring, just looking the way a man looks at a horse he's deciding whether to buy. Bevis laughed and said something about how he'd have left the wire and gone in, and the young trooper said something about his uncle's fence, and the moment closed over like water over a stone. The tracker went out with a lantern to get the rifle. He was gone 11 minutes. I counted every one of them with the whole yard laid out in my head, the fence where she'd stood, the 4 steps she'd taken to come in, and out past the woodpile to the cold room door and the little half-drift the wind had thrown up against it, which anyone with eyes could see had been disturbed, because I'd opened it 40 minutes before. He came back in and stamped the snow off and handed me my rifle. He said, you should not leave this in the wet. No, I said. He looked at me for 1 second longer than a stranger looks at a stranger. Then Bevis said, Charlie, sit down and eat, you make me nervous, and the tracker sat down. They stayed the night. Of course they did. There was 14 inches on the ground and rising. Bevis and the young one slept on the floor by the stove. The gray one slept sitting up in a chair with his chin on his chest, and he snored like a saw in green wood. Charlie, that's what they called him, and I never once heard any of them call him anything else, rolled up in his blanket against the far wall in the corner by the cold room door. I lay in my own bed with my eyes open and listened to my house be full of people for the first time in 3 years. Sometime past 2, the boy made a sound. It came through that door, small, a hitch of breath, the kind that goes on to be a cry. I sat up. I couldn't help it. My whole body came off that mattress like it was on a spring, and I sat there in the dark with my heart slamming, and across the room I saw Charlie's head lift up off his arm. He was awake. He'd been awake. We looked at each other across a room with 3 sleeping soldiers in it. And the sound stopped. It didn't taper off, it didn't get muffled, it stopped clean. The way a lamp goes out, and I knew what that meant. I knew a woman's hand was over a child's face in the cold dark behind a hanging deer, and I knew he wasn't fighting it, because he had been taught not to on the 9th night on a mountain, and it had taken. He had learned. That was the whole horror of it. There was no struggle to hear. Charlie put his head back down on his arm. Bevis snored. The stove ticked, and I lay back down in my bed and stared at a ceiling I built with my own hands, and I thought about a woman sitting in a meat locker holding her sister's baby's mouth shut so she wouldn't die, and I understood that the food on that table hadn't saved anybody. It never had. It was just the only language I had, and I'd been shouting it. Oct 15, clear, cold as a well. They left Tilda 8. The morning was that blue you only get after a hard snow, and everything was so bright it hurt, and the four of them stood in my yard putting on gloves. Bevis shook my hand and told me I made a fine cornbread, and that if I saw anything I should ride down and tell them, and that he hoped I'd find something to open those peaches for, and he meant every word of it, and he had a woman's death in his saddlebag as a line of writing on a piece of paper. The young one wanted to say something about my brother and couldn't work out how. The gray one said, "Obliged." They went down toward the gate. Charlie stayed. He knelt down and made a long business of his cinch, and when they were 40 yards off he stood up and put his hand in his coat pocket and took something out and held it toward me. It was the rock. That gray river stone the boy had put on my table next to the peaches. Charlie had picked it up sometime in the night, or at supper, or when he handed me my rifle, and I never saw him do it, and if Bevis had ever turned that stone over in his fingers and asked one question, I don't know what would have happened, but it would have happened. I took it. It was warm from his pocket. He said, "That is from the blue. There is a green in it and this white. You do not get that here." I said nothing. He looked out at the snow, out past the fence, where you can see 40 miles on a day like that. There was ice in the ends of his hair. He said, "They will come back up, not this way. The pass at Blue Ridge in 3 days when the snow packs. There will be men on it." He said it the way a man reads a bill of sale. "There will be no one on the old burn north past the 2 snags. It is bad ground. Nobody watches bad ground. It is 4 days walking and there is no water and there is nothing to eat." He turned and looked at me. 4 days, he said. "That is a long time for a woman who has eaten one supper." And I stood in the snow with a stone in my fist, and I couldn't say anything at all. "They will send someone," he said. "If I do not find them, you understand this. Do not think that I am." He stopped. Something went across his face. I have thought about it every year since, and I have never gotten to the bottom of it. "My wife is at the fort," he said. "My daughters, they do not go on the train while I am useful." He got on his horse. I said, "Charlie." He said, "That is not my name," and he looked down at me from the saddle with an expression I could not read, and then he rode down my road after the soldiers, and I never saw him again as long as I lived. I got her out of that cold room, and she could not stand up. Not from fear. Her legs had stopped working. She'd been sitting on frozen dirt for 11 hours with a child in her arms, and when I opened the door she was still holding her hand over his mouth, still in the dark, an hour after they'd gone. I had to pry her fingers off him one at a time. She was looking at the wall. I carried her, I want to be honest. I dragged her. She was fighting me a little. She didn't know where she was. And I put her in front of the judge, and I put the boy in her lap, and I built that fire up until the stovepipe glowed dull red, and I could smell the burnt wool coming up out of the ashes, and I didn't care. She came back slow, first her eyes, then her hands. Then she said, "The coat." And I told her. She sat there a long time. Then she said, "It was my sister's man's coat," and that was all she ever said about it, and I have never in my life been sorrier for anything. We had one day. That was Charlie's gift, and neither of us ever spoke his name out loud, then or after, because we didn't have it. I fed her every 2 hours, Small, the way you'd water a foundered horse. She slept in my bed and I put her there myself, and she was asleep before I got her boots off. The boy would not sleep. He sat on the floor by the wood box, silent, watching the door, and after a while I sat down next to him with my back against the box and pretended to whittle nothing out of a piece of kindling. And after about an hour, he leaned over sideways and put his head against my arm and slept there. I sat still for 2.5 hours. At noon I fried potatoes and the smell woke her, and she came to the table, and she pulled out the chair herself, and she sat down like it was a thing she'd always done. And the boy laughed at something, at a spoon, at the way I dropped a spoon, and it was such a small, ugly little laugh, so rusty, and Beshka put down her fork and went out of the room. She stood in the cold room with the door open, and I heard her breathing. That's the sound I'd take with me if I could only keep one, not the crying, the breathing after. I packed her 110 pounds of things she couldn't carry, and she went through it on the floor and put 90 of it back. She took dried meat, cornmeal, a flint, my good knife after arguing, a canvas she cut into a strap, 2 of my shirts, one for her and one to wrap the boy. She would not take the money, and we had an argument about it in 2 languages, and neither of us won. She took the tin of peaches. I said, "Those are heavy." She said, "Yes." I made the offer at dusk. I'd been building up to it all day like a man, walking up on a horse that's already looking at him. I said, "Leave him with me." She went absolutely still. I said it all at once because if I stopped I'd lose it. There's men down at Pleasant Valley with a dozen kids they can't account for. Nobody rides up here. He'd be a Hands boy, a Mexican boy. Whatever we say he is, nobody comes up here, Beshka. Nobody has come up this road in 3 years except them, and they're gone. He'd be fed. He'd be warm. He would be alone. He'd be alive. She looked at me, and I watched her mouth harden, and I said the thing I had no right to say. The thing that had been sitting in my chest since she said it to me on the floor by the stove. "You're carrying 26 pounds, I said. 4 days across a burn with no water. You said your sister was faster than you. She gave you the child so you wouldn't have to choose." Silence. "I'm giving you the choice back." The fire ate. Outside the snow was going blue. She stood up and she walked to the window and she put both hands on the sill, and I saw her shoulders go up and stay up, and she stood there for a long, long time. And she said, without turning around, "Then I would be the one who lived." I said, "Yes." "And she would have died so that I could live." Her voice was very level. "And he would grow, and he would eat at your table, and he would not know one word of what she said to me on that rock. He would not know her name." She turned around. "You want to feed him," she said. "You do not know what it costs to be fed." I woke at 3 in the morning because the door was open. Cold on my face. That's what did it. I came up out of sleep and the bed was empty and the door was standing open to the yard and the moon was on the snow and my whole body knew before my head did. The boy was in the bed. Asleep, rolled in my shirt, breathing, one fist curled by his chin. She'd left him. I have never in my life moved the way I moved. I went out into that yard in my socks and I ran, and the snow came up over my knees, and I got about 30 feet before I saw her. She was at the fence, standing at the wire in the moonlight with a bundle on her back and no coat, in the exact place she'd stood 5 nights. No, one night, it had been one night with both hands on the top wire, looking out at the country. She'd gotten as far as the fence. I stopped about 10 feet behind her. I didn't touch her. I stood there in my socks in 14 inches of snow and my feet were screaming and I didn't say anything. And after a while she said, without turning around, in a voice I had to lean in to hear, "I am not as fast as her." She said, "I got to the wire and I could not put my hand on it." She said she could do it. She did it and she did not even. And then she just stood there with her shoulders going, silently, the way she did everything. I walked up and I stood beside her, and I put my hand on the wire. After a while she put hers next to it. We went in. They left before light on the 16th of October, 1887. She had the boy on her back in the mended cradle board. She had my knife and a canvas strap and a tin of peaches that weighed more than it was worth. She had one of my shirts on under one of Ott's coats, and she looked ridiculous, and she looked like somebody who was going to walk 4 days across a burn. At the gate she stopped. She said, "Amos." It was the only time she ever used it. She said, "The bucket." I said, "I know." She said, "You threw it out in the mud. I was so angry with you. I thought, this man is going to make me ask." She adjusted the strap on her shoulder. Her breath went up white. "I have never hated anyone the way I hated you for 1 minute in that yard." I said, "I'd do it again." And she almost smiled. That's as close as she ever got with me. Then she reached back and took the boy's hand and made it wave at me, which he did not want to do, and she turned and walked north, and the snow took them into the trees inside of 4 minutes. I stood at that gate until the sun came up and my feet went dead. Then I went in and looked at my house. Ox 16, 2 at the table, they are gone north, God keep them. That's the whole entry. It's the only time God is mentioned in 11 years of that ledger. I never heard from her. There was no way for me to. She could not write, and I did not know where she was going, not truly. And if I'd known, I wouldn't have written it down anywhere. And every spring for 6 years, I rode the burn looking for what I was afraid of finding, and I never found it. And I choose to call that an answer. I stopped setting out Ott's plate. I didn't decide to. I just came in one evening in November and cooked one supper and sat down, and it wasn't until I was scraping the pan that I understood what I hadn't done, and I sat back down in that chair and put my face in my hands. The dog bucket stayed by the stove. It's still there. I never got another dog. Now here's the part I've been walking around this whole time. 8 years later, I was in Hallbrook buying wire, and there was a man in the freight office, an old cavalry man, drunk in the middle of the afternoon and telling anybody who'd listen about the territory. And he got on to the scouts. What happened to the scouts? He said a name I didn't recognize, and I asked him to say it again. He said they'd hanged some. Not for anything they did, for something they were in a bad year, when Washington wanted a thing to point at. He said the ones they didn't hang went east on the train with everybody else, scouts and all, in the same cars as the people they'd hunted, and the army took their medals off some of them at the depot, and their wives were already on board. He said there was one, up on the rim in '87, who lost a woman and a child in the snow. Just lost them. Best tracker in the territory, the man said, and he walked a yard with 14 inches of fresh powder on it and came back and said nothing here. I stood in that freight office with a coil of wire in my hands. I have spent my whole life being told that I did a good thing in October of 1887. I told it once at a funeral drunk, and people looked at me a certain way after. Teague fed an Apache woman. Teague hid her from the soldiers. It follows me. It has made me, in the eyes of a few men in this county, better than I am. I cooked a supper. He walked out into a yard he could read like a page, and he saw 4 steps in the mud, and a small heel by the cold room door, and a drift that had been broken open, and he came back inside and he lied with his family on a list 1,000 miles away, and he handed me my rifle and told me not to leave it in the wet. I gave her food, which I had. He gave her the only thing he had left, which was his hand on the scale. And she went north across a burn with a tin of peaches, and I don't know what became of any of them. And every year I get further from being able to find out, and I set one plate, and I am 71 years old. The stone is on the table. It's been there 34 years. It has a green in it and a white, and I have been told there is no creek within 100 miles that makes them like that. So it came a long way in a child's fist, and it got put down next to a tin of peaches by a boy who had learned not to cry. Sometimes I pick it up when I'm sitting there. It's the size of an egg. It's warm if it's been in the sun. She asked me for the scraps because that's what she'd been taught she was worth, and I put a table in front of her because that's the only sentence I know how to say. And I have never been sure, not once, not in 34 years, whether that was a kindness or whether it was just a man too proud of his own.